If you're still awake, you're not alone. Welcome to Things I Can't Explain. I don't have a name for you to call me, and maybe that's better for tonight. We gather here when the world gets quiet enough to hear the things we usually ignore. These aren't just scary stories, they're the moments where logic just stops working. Where you look behind you, and you wonder if you imagined the shadow. Or maybe you didn't. Tonight, we're going to walk through the dark together. Let's get into the first one. I've never told anyone this, not even the people I love most, because the words feel cheap when you try to say them out loud. It happened on a Tuesday in late October, 3 years ago, on a stretch of forest road outside of Duluth that barely shows up on any map. The air was already freezing, the kind of cold that bites through your jacket, and the only light came from my truck's dashboard and the pale, sickly moon filtering through the pines. I had stopped the car because the compass was spinning wildly, a cheap plastic thing I'd bought at a gas station, and the silence was so heavy it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I thought it was just the battery dying or a weird trick of the magnetic field, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave when I turned the engine back on. I never told anyone because they'd just say it was a bad night's sleep, but the truth is, I know what happened, and I still don't know how I'm still here. I was a guy who loved being alone in the woods. I'd been hiking the same trail since I was a kid, so I knew every dip in the road in which trees had hollowed out their trunks. It was just a routine drive back from a job site when I decided to cut through the backwoods instead of taking the highway. The trees there are ancient, the kind with bark that looks like wrinkled skin, and the path was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. I kept the heater on high, but the cold seemed to get into the cab anyway. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the birds had stopped. That was the first thing that felt off. It was late in the day, the kind of time when jays and crows would be squawking, but the forest was dead silent. I thought maybe I was hearing things, or that the snow had muffled the noise, so I rolled the window down to listen. The air smelled wrong, not like pine or dirt, but like something metallic and stale, like old pennies left in the rain. I figured it was just a trick of the wind coming off a nearby creek. I kept driving, telling myself I was overthinking it, just trying to get back to my truck before dark. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't static, just a low, rhythmic buzzing that sounded like it was coming from inside the speakers, or maybe from inside my head. I turned it off, but the sound didn't stop. I pulled the car over again, thinking I could check the battery or fix the wiring, but the moment I stepped out of the truck, the ground felt different. It wasn't the usual crunch of leaves or the give of frozen soil, it was like walking on something soft, almost spongy. I looked down at my boots and saw that the mud had turned a deep, bruised purple. I kicked the tree nearest to the road, expecting the solid thud of wood, but my boot sank in as if the trunk were made of wet sponge. I laughed then, a nervous, brittle sound that seemed too loud in the silence. I tried to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Not a stall, but a complete silence, like the battery was gone. I checked the fuses, my hands shaking now, and when I pulled my hand back, the inside of my palm was covered in that same purple sludge. I convinced myself it was rust leaking from a new pipe, that the truck was just old and failing, but the air was getting colder, faster, and the shadows between the trees seemed to be stretching toward me, elongating in ways that didn't match the angle of the moon. I ran back to the truck, locking the doors, but the windows were fogging up from the inside, not the outside. Condensation that shouldn't have been there. I wiped them with my sleeve, but the fog just reappeared instantly, thicker and blacker than steam. Then came the knocking. It wasn't on the door, it was on the hood of the truck, right above the engine. A slow, deliberate tap. 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 I looked through the windshield and saw a shape standing there, tall and thin, the silhouette of a person but with no face, just a smooth, blank oval where features should be. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I tried to scream, but my throat felt full of that same metallic taste. The shape raised a hand, and the frost on the glass began to crack, spreading in jagged lines that formed a pattern I couldn't explain. It looked like a map, or maybe a countdown. The engine started suddenly, roaring to life with a sound that wasn't mechanical, more like a scream. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning, and the ground seemed to pull at the rubber. I managed to lurch forward, the truck surging past the figure, but as I drove away, I saw it move. It didn't walk, it just slid, gliding over the ground in a blur that made my eyes water, catching up to the truck in a way that defied physics. I drove for what felt like hours, the needle on the temperature gauge climbing into the red, even though the air outside was freezing. The figure was still there, sometimes visible through the side window, sometimes just a shadow that seemed to stretch from the trees and touch the glass. I remember looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the road behind me stretching on forever, the trees forming a perfect, unbroken wall that blocked out the sky. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the purple mud that was now coating the entire windshield. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a numbness that started in my toes and moved up my legs. The figure was right against the passenger window now, its faceless head tilted, and I could see the texture of the wood around me changing, the dashboard softening, the steering wheel becoming pliable and wet. I slammed my hand against the wheel, and it felt like pressing into raw meat. I screamed, a raw, tearing sound, and the truck finally broke through the wall of trees, slamming onto the main road where the pavement was hard and solid. The figure was gone, the trees were normal again, but the smell of copper was still in the air, and my hands were covered in that purple sludge, staining the leather seats where they had gripped the wheel. I got home, washed the car, and drove to the police station to report the accident, but there was no evidence of the crash, no scratches on the vehicle, no purple stains on the seat. I told them I had a breakdown, that I just lost my way in the fog. They drove me home, checked my vitals, and let me go. 3 days later, I went back to the spot. The road was just a dirt track, the trees were normal, and the compass worked fine. I walked into the woods, looking for that one tree, the one that felt like a sponge. I found it, but when I pressed my hand against the bark, it was hard and cold, just like any other tree. I waited there for an hour, listening to the birds return, hoping to see something, anything. But the only thing I found was a single, fresh footprint in the mud, right where I had been standing, and it wasn't mine. It was barefoot, and the toes were too long, and the print was still wet, as if someone had just stepped out of the ground, leaving it there for me to find. I still have the printout in my journal, a picture of that single, impossible footprint, and I don't know if I'm the only one who remembers it, or if it happened to everyone who ever drove that road. This happened to me 3 years ago, in the middle of a blizzard that seemed to swallow the whole world. I was stuck at the Blackwood Rest, a gas station and motel that sits off Route 9, miles from the nearest town. It was 2 in the morning when the radio went static, and the road disappeared entirely, leaving me alone in a room that felt too small for the silence outside. I had driven down there just to avoid the city traffic, hoping a quiet night's sleep would clear my head. The place was old, the kind of motel where the carpet smells like stale cigarettes and the walls are paper thin. My room, 14, was on the end of the long hallway, which usually meant less foot traffic, but on this night, it felt like a cage. I remember the radiator hissing constantly, a rhythmic clanking that kept time with the wind. I'd wake up and hear the front door open, but when I peeked through the peephole, the snow would be blowing straight in, and no one would be there. I told myself it was just the settling of the old wood, the wind finding cracks in the frame. I even checked the lock myself, 3 times, just to be sure. I had a bag of groceries in the corner and a cold beer on the nightstand, feeling like I was just waiting out a storm, nothing more. By the second night, the silence felt heavier, like pressure in my ears. I couldn't go to sleep, so I sat by the window watching the snow pile up against the glass. That's when I noticed the first mark on the windowpane. It wasn't a smudge or frost, it was a perfect, thin line drawn from the inside out, like someone had dragged a fingernail across the glass. I wiped it away, assuming it was condensation, but it came back an hour later, lower this time. I told myself I was just tired, that the blizzard was messing with my head. Then, the radiator started making a scratching sound, like metal dragging against metal, but from inside the wall. I knocked on the drywall, shouting, "Is someone there?" No answer, just the sound of water hammering in the pipes, loud and rhythmic. I tried to call the front desk, but the line was dead, a constant dial tone that never stopped. The cold in the room began to drop, visible breath forming even though the heater was blasting. The third night, I locked the door and the window, but I still heard the scratching on the other side of the door. It wasn't frantic, it was slow, methodical. I pressed my ear against the wood, and I heard breathing. Not the sound of someone breathing, but the sound of wet, heavy air moving in and out of a lung that wasn't there. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought for protection. The light flickered and died, leaving me in the blue-gray glow of the street lamp outside. That's when the door handle turned. Slowly. Without a sound. I grabbed the bat, ready to swing, but the knob just stopped, vibrating in my hand. Then, a voice whispered right against the lock, "Let me in." It wasn't a human voice, it sounded like wind rushing through a hollow pipe, distorted and layered. The temperature plummeted so fast my breath froze on my eyelashes. The door didn't open, but the lock mechanism started to spin on its own, grinding against the metal, the internal tumblers clicking in a chaotic, frantic rhythm. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the handle as the lock continued to click, faster and faster, until the door frame itself began to vibrate. The light came back on, harsh and blinding, and I saw the handle stop moving. But the door was open. Not just cracked, but wide open, revealing the hallway. But the hallway wasn't empty. It was filled with snow, blowing in from the outside, piling up against the doorframe, yet the room was freezing cold, not warm. I stumbled back, screaming, and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. Through the crack under the door, I saw the snow inside the room start to move, piling up against the walls, rising higher and higher, but the snow wasn't melting. It was moving toward me, sliding across the floor like a liquid, reaching the bottom of the bathroom door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the drive home. I drove straight through, eyes wide, avoiding the rearview mirror. When I finally got back to my apartment, I checked the room. The door was locked, the windows were closed, and the place was spotless. But on the floor, where I had thrown my shoes, there was a pile of fresh snow. It didn't melt. It sat there, a perfect, unmoving mound, and I still keep it on the floor. It's not melting, even in the summer heat. I just keep it there, wondering if the snow in that room was ever really snow, or if it was something that followed me out, something that learned how to fit into a normal house, waiting for the next time the door opens on its own. I don't know where it came from, and I don't know what it wants. I just know that sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I hear the sound of wet feet walking across the floor, and the snow pile gets a little bigger. This happened to me last Tuesday, around 2:15 a.m. I was walking home through the empty lot behind the old 24-hour pharmacy on 4th Street. The streetlights were flickering, casting long, jittery shadows that made the parked cars look like they were breathing. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and stale coffee from the dumpster. I had just left a double shift at the warehouse, my bones aching, and I thought the quiet was the best kind of relief. I didn't know yet that the quiet was waiting for me. I've walked that route 1,000 times. I know the rhythm of the parking lot, the way the concrete cracks align with the rusted chain-link fence, and exactly where the shadows stretch deepest under the flickering sodium lamps. It's a mundane, unremarkable place where I usually just check my phone and walk fast. That night, the lot was completely dead. No cars moving, no distant traffic, just the hum of the refrigeration units from the building behind me. There was one detail that I told myself I imagined, the smell of something sweet and rotting, like overripe fruit or old lilies, suddenly filling the air right before I turned the corner toward my car. I blamed it on the dumpster. I assumed I was just tired and imagining the breeze carrying the scent from the alley behind the pharmacy. It seemed like nothing, just my exhausted brain trying to find a pattern in the static of a lonely night. But the silence started to feel heavy, pressing against my eardrums like water. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I saw a shadow detach itself from the side of a blue sedan and slide under the next car. It wasn't the shadow of a person, it was too thin, too fluid, like ink spilled on the ground. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a glitch in my eyes from the fatigue. I kept walking, my heart rate picking up, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then, my phone buzzed in my hand. No notifications, just a single vibration that felt like a tap on the screen from the outside. I looked at the display. The screen was cracked, but the crack wasn't there a moment ago. It ran right through the word "home" on my lock screen. I laughed nervously, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, but when I looked up, the flickering streetlight above me stopped. It just hung there, dead, leaving the lot in a darkness so absolute it felt like I was underwater. I stopped dead, clutching my keys. The darkness wasn't just around me, it was closing in. I could hear breathing. Not the heavy panting of a jogger, but a wet, rhythmic sound coming from directly behind the car I was trying to reach. I spun around, shining my flashlight beam into the blackness between the rows. Nothing was there. Just rows of parked cars and the chain-link fence. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so hard I dropped them. They clattered on the concrete, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. As I reached down to grab them, I felt a hand on my ankle. It wasn't a human hand. It was cold, dry, and smelled like that sweet rot. I scrambled backward, kicking out, and finally got my door open, slamming it shut as I heard a sound like a jaw unhinging, right outside my window. I locked the doors and sped away, tires screeching on the wet pavement. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks over, sitting in my own driveway with the engine running, hyperventilating. I waited for an hour to make sure they weren't following me, then stumbled inside, locked the deadbolt, and collapsed on the couch. I haven't been able to sleep since. Every time I close my eyes, I smell that rot. But here is the part one still can't explain. When I finally got up this morning to make coffee, I found the keys on my kitchen counter. They weren't in my pocket when I came inside. They were laid out perfectly, one by one, arranged in a straight line. And right in the middle of the keys, the one that fits the front door of my apartment, was a single, fresh tire tread mark. I don't drive to the pharmacy lot from the highway. I don't have a car. And I don't know how the tire mark got there, unless the thing in the parking lot followed me, and it's been inside my house the whole time, waiting for me to look at it. So, what do you make of all that? Sometimes, it feels like we're just waiting for the next shadow to move on its own. If something like this has ever happened to you, even in a small way, I'd really like to hear about it. Please drop your story in the comments, sometimes reading them makes me feel less alone in the quiet. In the next video, I have some accounts that are even harder to explain, where logic just stops working. If you want to keep up with these stories, please make sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening to me this late at night. Stay safe.